We're all told that alcohol is very bad for you, but actually the evidence is quite the reverse.
So, Tony, why did you write 2 books talking about the health benefits of booze? You've, of course, written the book, The Good News About Booze, and your most recent book, The Very Good News About Wine.
I was writing an article about the calorie theory and about calories put on weight and all of that kind of stuff. And I came across an interesting study, in fact, many interesting studies showing that alcohol does not put on weight, even though it's very high in calories. I thought, that's really interesting. I wonder what else is interesting about alcohol. So I spent 6 months in a medical library, a big medical library in London, discovering that actually there is a lot more to discover about alcohol which is sort of almost totally nonconformist. We're all told that alcohol is very bad for you, but actually the evidence is quite the reverse. In small doses, alcohol is very good for your health. I can give you an example. I mean, a lot of the propaganda now is about tobacco and how terribly dangerous it is. But if I can just show you a graph of what happens to your health when you smoke tobacco, it looks a bit like this. Where has it gone? There we are. There. So the more you smoke, the more dangerous, there's more risk of ill health goes up like that. However, what the evidence very clearly shows with wine and alcohol, the reverse is the case. Up to a certain point, when you drink alcohol, the risk, can't really see my picture because you brought me up, but the risk goes down. So, and then as you drink a little bit more, the risk starts to go back up. But actually, this sort of area here is where it's doing you good. It reduces the risk of ill health there. So that's the thing that the authorities don't want you to know. They don't want you to know about what's called the J curve, because it looks like a J, that graph. The J curve has been known about for 100 years now in terms of alcohol. It was first found out in about the 1920s by the insurance companies, the life insurance companies, who discovered something very odd about people who drank. They seemed to live longer. Very strange, they thought. And then that was ignored for a bit. And then back in the 1950s, they started looking at it in a much more scientific way and comparing people who didn't drink with people who did drink, and found, lo and behold, that the drinkers lived longer and healthier lives than the non-drinkers. And this has been consistently shown for the last 70 years. So that was my first book, Good News About Booze. I liked the title because it had a nice rhythm and a rhyme to it, booze and news. And then there you are, drinking a glass of wine, excellent. So, and then that came out in 2013. And I thought, well, I've done the thing now, and everybody knows now that alcohol is quite good for you within limits. And then in about 2016, the medical authorities around the world had a concerted effort to demonize alcohol. And they kept on saying more and more that, the idea that alcohol is good for is an old wives' tale, it's nonsense. And actually, the evidence is quite the reverse, that a drop of alcohol will send you to an early grave. Now, that was an outright lie. As I know, I'd spent 6 months looking at the evidence, a complete lie. And I thought, right, well, I'm going to hit them in the solar plexus now with my second book, because there is absolutely no question that wine is the most health-giving, health-promoting alcohol you can drink. So I thought this is an easy open goal. I can write a book about wine, showing how very good for you it is. So that was the second book, The Very Good News About Wine, which came out last year. And but again, the World Health Organization completely ignored the contents of my book, saying there's no safe level of alcohol consumption, and that's proved by science. And the thing is, the authorities lie through their teeth, and that's what really motivated me to write these 2 books, because I hate it when the authorities lie about the evidence, and the evidence is very clear. All they have to do is go to a medical library and spend 6 months looking at the research and say, come up with the same conclusion that I did.
What's the reason that they're lying about this for?
I think there's a kind of puritanism out there, really. I think they don't like the idea of people having fun. I mean, certainly they're now talking about people not being allowed to fly an aircraft anymore and go on holidays because they don't want, the CO2, climate change nonsense. But I mean, they just don't like the idea of ordinary people having a bit of fun. And I think they're also trying to be holier than thou as well. But I think it's probably a kind of Puritanism, or maybe it's just the old temperance movement from the 19th century when people were discouraged from drinking because they used to hit their wives over the head and be violent in the streets. But I mean, nobody's suggesting now that alcohol is not a bad, dangerous drug in terms of its fueling antisocial behavior. Nobody's questioning that. But the point that they're trying to say is, well, let's forget, they don't talk about violence, they just talk about health, and they think that the health issue is the one to to capture the public's imagination. And, I don't know, I've really been puzzling about it. I think it must be a Puritanism of some kind.
In your book, The Good News About Booze, you basically talked about how in the 1980s they came up with these drinking guidelines, and the drinking guidelines were just hypothetical. Like they never actually had any research or anything. It was just kind of like researchers got together, made up some numbers, and then over the years they've actually lowered the number. But again, they've lowered this number that was already artificial and hypothetical in the first place. So when someone says moderate drinking is good for you, first off, what does moderate drinking even mean? And then secondly, how did we determine what moderate drinking even means if we just make up numbers?
It's very difficult to determine exactly what it is, but I can tell you that in the wine book, I show the latest research on the beneficial effects of wine, and this team of Czech scientists did a very big meta-analysis of the total world data over the last 50 years, and they came up with the following conclusion: that for a man, the optimum that you should not drink more than 2/3 of a bottle of wine a day. 2/3 of a bottle of wine a day. At that point, the J curve starts to hit this point here, and about 2/3 of a bottle of wine, you start to hit that point there. So you get into kind of negative territory. That's all positive territory below there, negative. So, I mean, and for a woman, it's about a half of that. So 1/3 of a bottle of wine a day for women. Now, a lot of people would think that's quite a lot. I mean, I drink more than that, because the other thing about the research is that a lot of the research is based on what people tell researchers they actually drink. And you can imagine that if you do surveys of people, say, how much do you drink a day? They always put a much lower figure. So you can almost double that figure of 2/3 of a bottle of wine. But people do lie to the extent of 50%. So roughly speaking, you will not come to any harm. I'm not giving you medical advice here. I'm just saying what the evidence says. You will not come to any harm as a man if you drink a bottle and a half of wine a day. Now, that is really quite a lot. And a woman about half that. So I'm just saying I'm a medical researcher. I'm not a doctor. I'm like Malcolm Kendrick. I'm not giving you advice what to drink and how much to drink. I'm just saying this is what the evidence actually says.
In terms of booze, we have beer, wine, and then spirits. We all have heard about the famous beer belly. Is there such a thing as a wine belly or a whiskey belly? I guess the ultimate question is, are any of these three kind of classifications healthier or less healthy than the others?
Yes, spirits, liquor is the least healthy. Beer has got some extra advantages in it over spirits because it's got some polyphenols and a few vitamins and minerals. But the problem with beer is that it's very high on the glycemic index. Now, the glycemic index measures the amount of glucose in a particular product, and it's extremely high, and so it is liable to put on weight. Whereas wine has zero. It scores 0 on the glycemic index, so it's not likely to put on weight at all. And that's why we have heard of beer belly, and nobody drinks enough. Well, actually, and also the fact about spirits is that alcohol itself does not put on weight. Although it does have calories, the calories are not bioavailable. A number of medical research studies have been done in hospitals on human beings showing that if you substitute food, say a certain amount of calories in food with the exact amount of calories in alcohol, in other words, you take out the food, but you put the alcohol calories back, you will lose weight. And this has been done countless times now, both in rats and human beings. So it's a well-known fact that although alcohol is very high in calories, almost as high in calories as fat, it does not have any effect on weight because calories are not bioavailable. Alcohol calories are not bioavailable. They're not recognized by the body.
Yeah, you talk about that in the book. I find it interesting that, basically you mentioned in the book how everyone knows that fat has 9 grams or 9 calories per gram. Carbohydrates has 4 calories per gram. Same thing with protein, but then alcohol has 7 calories per gram. But then you're mentioning how basically this is also kind of the time of like a more of a temperance movement or Puritans. And so they, like you talked to kind of about the experiments that they use, like just because you can burn alcohol, like everyone knows, like what's the expression? The proof's in the poof, right? So like you used to light alcohol on fire to see what the purity of it was, but there's a big difference between you lighting a match and seeing if the proof's in the poof or how your body actually digests it, aka is it bioavailable? I mean, those are 2 separate things. Like you mentioned in the book, coal produces a lot of energy. So should we start, eating coal because it has a high caloric intake, or is that just maybe we can't digest it?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite right. It's a totally antiquated theory invented by a man, I've forgotten his name now, back in the 1850s, where he put foods, we're talking about the calorie theory now, he put foods into a thing called a bomb calorimeter to try and work out how much energy they had. And a bomb calorimeter looked like a little furnace. And it was a very crude, primitive system where he would put fat, and then burn it, and then you'd see that a lot of heat came off. So he imagined that the human body was like a furnace, where or as you said, like coal, you put your coal in the furnace and you heat. It's, total nonsense. I mean, the body is very, very complex machine. And actually, we now know that the way that the body uses up the energy, quote unquote, within food is to do with the glycemic index. So the more you raise your glucose levels, the more you put on fat if you don't use up that glucose, which is why carbohydrates are very, very high are high in the glycemic index, particularly refined carbohydrates like sugar and white bread and so on. So this is one of the the weight issue is another thing that the authorities try to kind of demonize alcohol over, and again it's a lie, complete lie. And you'll see, on the side of bottles, this bottle contains X calories. It's absolute bloody nonsense.
What are the main health benefits of alcohol?
The main one that was first discovered was heart disease, and that is the absolute blunderbuss, blockbuster benefit. Now, all alcohol will do that. Spirits, wine, and beer. But there's the J curve, slightly changes on depending on what you're drinking. Spirits, the J curve is quite steeper than beer, and that's because of the other ingredients, the beneficial ingredients within beer, and it's least steep with wine. So the greatest benefits come with wine, followed by beer, followed by spirits, and ideally one should not use spirits to do anything health-wise because they don't have any goodness in them. Better to drink something that's got some goodness in it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it makes sense. Oh, go ahead, Tony.
Sorry, and then, I mean, there's dementia. Sorry, the next one down the list is diabetes, because that's closely related to heart disease. And again, diabetes is very closely related to the glycemic index. So you can reduce your risk of diabetes significantly, whatever alcohol you drink. But again, the order is spirits worst, beer second, wine third, and that goes all the way through to dementia and so on. So that's the dementia. That's a really interesting one because there's a very interesting study done in Sweden on women who they followed for 75 years. Sorry, I'm trying to remember the exact study. But anyway, they were looking at wine drinking women, and they found that they had a massively reduced risk of dementia. So reduced that actually they had zero risk of dementia. These were people who drank wine regularly. And again, in Sweden, they don't drink that very much wine as it happens, because it's very, very expensive. There you are, slicking the wine. It's pretty expensive. So, I mean, it's a very moderate amount of alcohol to reduce your risk of Alzheimer's to zero. That was just one study, but there are other studies in Germany and Denmark are showing very much the same thing. So the three big ones are heart disease, followed by diabetes, followed by dementia. And there are a load of other many minor diseases like the common cold. You reduce your risk of the common cold if you drink anything, wine, beer, or spirits. Even multiple sclerosis, bizarrely, is reduced if you drink wine in particular. Anyway, these are lots of little minor ones.
What about sleep? We always hear that if you drink alcohol, it interferes with your sleep cycles, your whole REM cycle, whatnot. What was the research that you saw with alcohol's effect on sleep?
I wasn't terribly impressed by it, and I don't think it's actually terribly rigorously done. But I mean, a lot of people do anecdotally say that. My wife said it. I drink anyway, so whether I've always been a bad sleeper, so however much I drink makes no difference. But no, I think there's a lot of anecdotal reports, and as I say, I'm not quite sure the science has been done to prove that one way or the other.
What's the biggest, say, lie or propaganda piece, the single biggest piece of propaganda related to alcohol that's just 100% factually not true, that we think is true?
Well, they have because of the heart disease one is such a clear-cut benefit. That's one of the ones that they do occasionally try and lie about. There's a very, very big study done by people in Cambridge University, I'm ashamed to say, it's in England, and about 6 years ago, they pulled together a series of about 25 studies looking at about over 500,000 people, and they came to the conclusion that the whole idea of alcohol and wine in particular being good for heart disease was a complete lie, and their press release said, we've disproved it completely. Now, I mean, to me, it was like someone saying there's no connection between lung cancer and smoking. I thought, so there must be something wrong with this study. I mean, if they're coming out with something which is so obviously false. And I wasn't the only one doing it. A number of other people who are experts in the field found the same thing. In this paper, which went to about 40 or 50 different pages with an appendix hidden within that data, was the J curve showing that a small amount of alcohol will reduce heart disease, but they covered it up. They completely smothered it. So, I mean, this is where really gets my goat. Scientists lying about scientific data is simply intolerable. That's the one they've been trying to focus on. And also the cancers, particularly with women and breast cancer, is the one that they really tend to like to scare women with, and then by proxy, everybody else. But the cancer risk in things like breast cancer is actually extremely low. And for example, wine drinkers, there is a very slight extra risk of cancer in wine drinkers, but it's no greater than drinking milk. Now, that's an extraordinary statement, but I found that studies on milk show that women who drink milk do have a slightly increased risk of breast cancer. But of course, they would never say, don't drink milk, nor demonize milk, because it's a healthy substance, as is wine. So the cancers are the one that I think people should be slightly worried about, because there are 3 or 4 cancers in this area of the body here, the mouth, the throat, and the esophagus, where there's no protection against the alcohol. Because once you get to the stomach, there are enzymes that break down the alcohol into harmless, non-carcinogenic compounds. But in this area, and as it goes down, there's a risk of an increased risk of cancers here. And so they can be quite high, actually, up to about 6 times the risk, which is pretty high. It's particularly the case with people who smoke, because there's something about the byproducts of tobacco which synergize with the alcohol and produce toxic carcinogenic compounds. So if you know a guy called Christopher Hitchens, he was a great British Anglo-American writer. He used to drink a lot and smoke a lot. He died of that cancer, esophageal cancer, or one of the cancers up there. I don't remember which one it was. But it was one of those throat cancers. So, you've got to be careful to moderate your drinking if you're a smoker. But the thing is, my book shows remarkably, and I was really pleased to see this, is you just take one particular nutrient called folate, which is vitamin B9, folate. If you take that, you will reduce your risk of cancer to virtually zero, including these cancers of the throat and neck. So, I mean, just speaking personally, I'm not giving advice here, but what I do is I take 400 micrograms of folate a day. That's what you need. And I'm sort of healthy. I won't tell you how old I am. I'm a pretty healthy chap. So that's the way I'm very pleased to see that there are literally 25 studies on folate. It's folate, not folic acid. Folic acid is folate is the natural form of folate, whereas the artificial form is folic acid because it's cheaper to make. But you've got to get the stuff that comes from vegetables, which is folate, the natural substance, and that is the stuff that has the goodies in it.
What do you think about the difference between, say, like craft beer and then your kind of like ultra processed craft beer, so to speak, whatever, when you're talking about like Miller Lite or Coors Light, or I'm not sure what you have in the UK, in Australia you would have you have VB, or is it like Victorian bitters, whatever? Because I mean, when I was researching the difference between like craft beer and say Miller Lite, I was basically saying a lot of the benefits of the beer is just kind of processed and filtered out in, say, a Miller Lite. And so the beer is actually a lot healthier because a lot of the studies that they're using are just comparing or they're using, say, Miller Lite, Coors Light, again, Natural Light, or some, Pabst Blue Ribbon, PBR, or something like that, which are just very highly processed beverages. So do you think if you were drinking, say, like an actual like beer that was brewed with more, say, primitive techniques, that you wouldn't necessarily have the beer belly and you'd be getting more health benefits? Or do you think it's just any beer is going to, because of
any beer will give you because of the glucose within it, and so there's not but the thing about wine is very, very interesting. Zero alcohol wines are now touted because they're so healthy, they don't have alcohol in. Now, when I wrote my wine book, I had no idea. When I sort of wrote my first The Good News About Booze book, there were no low alcohol wines then, so I had no idea about that. And when I came back to the same subject, I thought, I've no idea what I'm going to find in the research material. I thought, well, maybe, taking a bit of the alcohol out might be beneficial, but, no idea. Maybe 50-50. I was absolutely staggered to find quite the reverse. When you take the alcohol out of wine, all the health benefits of wine disappear. Now, that is an extraordinary paradox. And it's a very cutting edge research. It's quite novel, this stuff. What they found is that there's a synergy between the polyphenols, which are the natural nutrients within grapes, interact in a synergistic, healthy way with alcohol to produce a thing called hydroxytyrosol. Now, hydroxytyrosol is a very, very powerful antioxidant, which means it's basically a healthy, like a mineral vitamin supplement, but extremely healthy indeed. And all of the studies show that if you think that if you want to be healthy, don't take the alcohol out of wine. Keep on drinking the real stuff. Don't buy the denatured stuff. And that, going back to what you're saying about processing, I think alcohol-free beers are processed in a totally different way from wine. I like alcohol-free lagers particularly, and I think what they do is they simply They simply kind of do something which prevents the yeast fermenting, but you get the nice flavors, the hops and so on from the beers. But in wine, they have to make real wine and then suck out the alcohol from it, and that is a highly processed, different processing. And of course, we all know that processed anything is really bad for you. So I think that could also the other reason. But what really staggered me was the fact that there's this wonderful health-giving synergy between the alcohol and the polyphenols that kind of really boosts your health.
Maybe about 15 years ago, I taught English in South Korea. And I'm from Wisconsin, the U.S., which is one of the biggest drinking states in the U.S. And then I went to South Korea, which drinks even more than what they drink in the U.S. And they also smoke. And then basically they drink soju, which is very similar. They have a very similar culture to like Japan. So instead of sake, it's soju and in Korea, in South Korea. But anyways, if you look, I was looking at like the countries that have the highest life expectancy. You have South Korea is in the top 3 in the world, and then the United States is like number 50 for life expectancy. The UK is like in the mid 40s, and yet a lot of especially like you go to like a lot of the European countries. I mean, they're drinking, they're smoking, they're drinking like coffee or espresso at like 8 o'clock at night while they're smoking, while they're drinking. These are all things that we're told are bad for us. Yet these countries live way longer than the people in the US or the UK. Yet it seems like you keep mentioning the World Health Organization. Yet the World Health Organization usually takes like its kind of indicators from the US, which is one of the least healthy countries on the planet. Like, I think we should just do the opposite of what the World Health Organization recommends. So why is the World Health Organization taking recommendations from one of the least healthy countries in the world?
Well, Trump has now pulled out, quite rightly, I think. So I suspect the influence of the United States, apart from Bill Gates, of course, will be much diminished in the WHO. But no, I agree with you. And also the thing about this is another bit of a health tip. Wine drinkers in Europe live longer than anybody else. Now, one of the reasons is that they have wine with their meals, and that's the important thing. The Mediterranean culture is to drink wine with a meal, and that is the healthiest way of doing it. And also, of course, they have the Mediterranean diet, which is a very, very high nutritious and zero crap food diet. So obviously they would live longer on that anyway. But the Mediterranean diet, there's Italian scientists have found this, that the things like olive oil and so on and so forth, and fresh fish and vegetables. But wine is an integral part of the Mediterranean diet, which is the healthiest diet on the planet. And the scientists in the universities have found that wine is 15%, has 15% of the value of a Mediterranean diet. In other words, if you don't drink wine and have a Mediterranean diet and you're a teetotaler, you won't get the full benefit of the Mediterranean diet. You've got to drink wine with it. With those meals.
We all hear about added sulfites and things like that. Every country, Spain is a big wine producer. Same thing with France, Portugal, like obviously Napa Valley in California. Is there any country that has, say, more pure wine, so to speak? And what about when people are like, oh, but this wine has all these sulfites? What should people look for when they're actually looking to purchase a bottle of wine?
Well, curiously enough, I think the country with the most draconian rules about sulfates is California. I mean, they have quite strict rules. Paradoxically, America, we think America is the kind of the source of all ill health, but actually their wines are quite good. The worst wines to drink, in my opinion, and depending of the evidence too, the South American wines. It's not so much for the sulfites, it's for the amount of chemicals they put on their crops. And there are no regulations about chemicals, or much fewer regulations in South America than there are, which is why, I find Chilean and Argentinian wines undrinkable, because there's obviously still a lot of residue. Whereas the European Union and California have quite strict rules about pesticide residues in the wine. Sulfites thing, I devote a little bit of the book about sulfites. I personally don't have a problem with them. And I think there's some people who are allergic, have asthmatic type personality or asthmatic type issues, tend to get the have an allergic reaction to it and get the headaches and so on. But actually, it's quite a small number in terms of, and I haven't found, I did look quite closely, I tried to find any other evidence of sulfites being bad for you. And that was the only thing I found was if you're an asthmatic, you may have problems, but nobody else has problems with sulfites. I think we all have problems with pesticides, that's for sure.
If anyone's ever read the Blue Zones, where the centenarians, people live to be 100 years old plus, there's obviously this zone in Italy, and in the book, I believe they drink Grenache, but it's like, one, is it the wine that's making these individuals live longer? Is the fact that they're drinking wine with their friends and hanging out? You have the social component. I mean, that's wine, right? Like you're hanging out at a pub or you're meeting people instead of sitting at home by yourself playing video games or watching TV or whatever. You're actually out socializing. Maybe you're getting some fresh air. So there's a lot of, kind of like, say, maybe side effects that are beneficial. But my question ultimately is there a certain type of grape or a certain wine that is better? Like, what's the healthiest of the wines?
Healthiest wines, there's not much work on it, but by and large, the color of the wine tells you how many polyphenols it's got in them. And polyphenols are the things that grapes, the nutrients that grapes produce to protect themselves against sunlight, of being damaged by sunlight. And so if they're protective for the plant, they're protective for us in terms of our immune system. So the rule of thumb is the darker the wine, the more polyphenols it's got, and therefore the healthier it is. And that's why white wine is the least healthy wine. It's not unhealthy, but it has fewer polyphenols, so it will be less healthy than red. The studies that have been done looking at actually wine varieties per se are not terribly convincing, and they're rather complicated, and they also disagree with each other. But I've spoken to a lot of the experts, and they said by and large the rule of thumb is the darker the wine, like a Primitivo or a Zinfandel, dark wine are the healthiest in terms of the amount of polyphenols, and that's what you should look out for.
And when you're
no reason not to drink white wine, because sorry.
Oh, yeah, finish your thought. I'm sorry, you finish your thought.
Well, there's no reason not to drink white wine because it's good, healthy for you too. But I have wine to begin the evening and then move on to red over my meal.
Tony, when you were mentioning California has some, the better quality wine, same thing with Europe, and then you mentioned how South America, you probably stay away from that. Australia is also a very big wine producer. And I mean, I did a working holiday visa in Australia for a year, super regulated. I would imagine maybe the wines in Australia would be pretty solid as well. Then would you recommend Australia? Would that be?
I would imagine that too, because it's a European kind of tradition. So I just think that the Latin Americans, I think, just spray everything with pesticides. But no, I suspect Australia would be equally beneficial in terms of health.
You're kind of mentioning before about how you would put wine number one, you'd put beer number two, and then you'd have spirits number three in terms of order of healthiness. What if you were to take like say like a Bloody Mary, where you have like the tomatoes and the spices and the peppers and the olives, and then you put some vodka in that? Would that be, if you're not a fan of wine or you're not a fan of beer, what are some mixed cocktails that you would recommend?
I've absolutely no idea. There's no research on cocktails whatsoever that I've found. And I suspect, if you take the analogy of wine and you add alcohol to the nutrients within tomatoes, maybe there might be some synergy there in the same way as you add alcohol in wine. It's a beneficial synergistic effect, but I have no idea, frankly. I don't do cocktails myself. I'm a bit of a purist about drinking.
Right. You're a purist of the wine, the Beano, right? So Tony, yeah. let's just kind of get kind of some simplification. So here, what would you recommend that, in order to get the health benefits for just, an average married couple, say 40, 50, 60, 70 years old, So what's a healthy amount that's going to give them the benefits? You're saying eat it with food. You're saying for what a guy, no more than 3/4 of a bottle of wine. Was it for a woman something around a quarter of a bottle? So if a married couple were drinking a bottle of wine every night with their dinner, I mean, is that how you'd recommend it? 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock dinner, have a bottle of wine, maybe another half while you're
Yeah.
watching the news or something, reading the newspaper.
Well, but Jesse, I'm not going to recommend. I'm a medical research journalist. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a physician. So none of what I'm saying is actually medical advice. This will clear you from any sin. But the evidence, the medical evidence very clearly shows that roughly the figure you've mentioned, sharing a bottle of wine between two over an evening meal is the healthiest way and the healthiest quantity of wine to drink, a red in particular. So you're right. You've got the message.
And then in terms,
and the other thing too is the time of day when you drink is very important. It shows one pages in my book where there's a thing called circadian rhythms, which is the body's way of. There's a clock within the body which regulates different functions within the body. There's a clock that helps you wake up in the morning and go to the loo and that kind of stuff. And there's a clock that regulates the amount of the activity of the alcohol detoxifying enzymes. Now, these are very important to slow down the amount of alcohol going into your bloodstream, and they take out the toxic effects of alcohol. And they operate on a 24-hour cycle, and their cycle is as follows. It starts off, they're very weak in the morning. So in other words, they won't work. And throughout the day, as you go through they become stronger at lunchtime, and then as the day goes on, their maximum strength in terms of the enzymes, detoxifying enzymes, about 6 o'clock in the evening. Now that's roughly the sort of time that most people have their evening meal. So in other words, Mother Nature has very cleverly organized things so that, there you are, drink, cheers, organized things so that the time that you want to eat in the evening is the time when the alcohol that you take is going to be most beneficial and least toxic. And I think, if you want to avoid being an alcoholic, for example, don't ever drink in the morning. I am saying that as a bit of advice, and the evidence is very strong. If you drink in the morning, you are setting yourself up to be an alcoholic. That's because the enzymes don't work very well. So you get a real hit mentally from the alcohol, and of course that's quite addictive. So the idea was to get the least hit mentally from the alcohol, so that you're not kind of addicted to the psychotropic effects of alcohol. You're only addicted to the beneficial effects when you're eating it and drinking it. And there's a whole little right about the end of the book, right? My FAQ section mentions all of this.
In your first book, The Good News About Booze, I found it interesting when you were like contacting like AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and other like researchers about like the research on alcoholism and what puts you on the path, and they basically didn't have any advice for you. It's like, well, once you're an alcoholic, we can help you, but it seemed like there was actually well, first off, what is an alcoholic? What are how does it progress? Like no one had an answer. You want to share that story? I thought that story was actually quite interesting.
I was quite shocked by that response. You'd expect that they would know how to prevent alcoholism. They did not want to know. They just said, "We'll wait until you become an alcoholic, and then we'll sort you out." I mean, they really didn't. They really don't have people's health really in mind. They just want to kind of see a lot of drunkards in their things and kind of squeeze the life out of them. Funny people sometimes, these do-gooders.
The do-gooders. What is it? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. I mean, isn't that what they say?
Absolutely.
What are things that we haven't talked about today that you've uncovered while researching this topic that we haven't discussed that's really important?
Okay, right. I think that this, again, the difference between the first book on booze in general and the second book on wine, that gave me 10 years to find some extra information. And the thing that really interested me was a thing called the microbiome. And the microbiome is your gut. And in the last few years, that's become a real buzzword amongst nutritionists, because they discovered that actually the microbiome, where you process your food and you eliminate it and you take the nutrients from it, is, they call it the second brain. It is a very, very important part of the body. And it is actually, it controls the immune system. Is that important? Everything, your immune system depends on the health of the microbiome. And again, I didn't know what I was going to find when I looked at the research. The research in the microbiome generally says that actually in the microbiome there are trillions of bacteria, some of them beneficial, some of them harmful, but the combination of the two, as the healthiest microbiome is where you have an even spread of healthy and unhealthy bacteria and viruses and so on. And the way to get that is to the best way of getting a healthy microbiome is to drink wine. It causes the healthiest microbiome, and I was staggered to find that. And the evidence is really very, very, very strong on that. So I think that's that's another way of reinforcing the health benefits of wine in general. We now know what the mechanism is. The mechanism is that your immune system is now boosted by the bacteria in your gut, and their health is boosted by the wine you're drinking. So the whole thing's a nice, the whole circle is kind of wound up now. We can get a beginning and the middle and the end. We understand what's actually happening now when we drink wine. So, I mean, it's really, really an important substance. It is an elixir of life. I mean, I don't think it's not an exaggeration. It really is a very, very, very healthy liquid.
Yeah, we mentioned Malcolm Kendrick, the doctor who we had on, wrote the Great Cholesterol Con. He's a retired general practitioner, and then he's got, I don't know, like 4 or 5 books. And one of his books, he's talking about vegetarianism, and he says that vegetarianism is actually funded. A lot of the studies were funded by Seventh-day Adventists because they're vegetarian, but they also like abstain from alcohol. So do you think like there's just a lot of kind of groups like that just fund these studies to quote unquote show that like quote unquote that alcohol is bad for you? I was shocked that the Seventh-day Adventists are one of the biggest funders of the vegetarian. I never even heard that before.
Well, I mentioned in my book that one of the things that's the anti-alcohol people criticize the researchers for is that they're obviously the ones that find the health benefits of alcohol have obviously been paid by the alcohol industry, and that is not the case. The alcohol industry is very careful not to fund original studies. They might fund studies looking at the totality of the research. Like I spent 6 months doing. They didn't fund me, by the way. I did it on my own bat. But and the converse is also, however, true. That the studies that show alcohol is not good for you are often funded by alcohol charities. I put the word charities in quotes. They're not charities, they're activist lobbying organizations that actually are literally charities. They get tax deductions and so on with people. And they are often, when you look at the small print of the study, you'll find that these charities have actually funded the anti-alcohol studies. So it's very similar to the Seventh-day Adventists. It's these activists, zealots who, will pay for studies to reinforce their prejudices.
So would you recommend that people, if they're if they're not wine drinkers, if they're beer drinkers, or they like cocktails, to switch to wine?
I would say that, as I've said before, that in terms of the hierarchy, beer is in the middle of the beneficial 3 main alcohols. And, craft beer will be probably very well made. It'll have excellent hops and excellent nutrients in. And so, by and large, it's probably much better than drinking spirits, but not as good as drinking wine. But in Britain, we used to have this very, very poor beer, and now the craft beers have come back in a big way, back to the old, 100 years ago. And there was a period in the 1950s where the beers were absolutely like soap water. They were revolting. the so-called not cask beers, the CO2 beers, carbon dioxide beers, the ones that you pull out like that. But no, I mean, I'm not a beer drinker, but I would imagine that if you get a craft beer, it'll have good ingredients, so why not go for it? But I would just advise against too much, because you don't want to get a beer belly, and that's not very sexy.
I live in a college town, and one of the things that I've noticed, I've talked to some of the managers of a few of the various breweries in town, and they say they're brewing a lot of, not necessarily no alcohol beers, but low alcohol beers. And then they say a lot of the college kids are drinking kind of like spritzers because they're all concerned about putting on weight. But I mean, what's a spritzer? It's basically just essentially say vodka and calorie-free lime juice or something like that, right? Like a Sprite or whatever. And so that's not necessarily healthy. So, I mean, is this trend? I mean, because basically it's talking about the caloric value of these beverages. So what do you think is going to happen with this kind of like low alcohol trend that we're seeing right now?
I don't know. I think, I mean, in the book, I suggest a possible scenario where people who drink low alcohol drinks go to special bars or pubs which cater for low alcohol, but they will, and they'll be, if you go to a bar with normal amounts of alcohol, it'll be a very special place. It'll be out in like with smokers. You've got to go outside in the rain, and suffer for your sin. I think the thing is that people are so brainwashed by the propaganda, they don't know that actually alcohol calories don't have any effect on weight, because it's so counterintuitive. You call a calorie, not so many calories, it must put on weight because they've been told that's what calories, quote unquote, do. And calories are complete fiction. They're, as we discussed earlier, they're a nonsense, medically and biologically nonsense. I have fear for the future, frankly, of the alcohol industry a little bit, because kids have been so brainwashed. And I think it's, enjoying yourself while drinking and eating good food is a real pleasure in life. And wine, I mean, I can't eat an evening meal now without wine. It's just something missing. It's like not having salt with your food, and it just makes the food so much tastier, and the whole experience of eating an evening meal so much richer, and you've got a lot of socializing when you do it, and it's a very, very sophisticated, very civilized way of living, which goes back to Greek and Roman times and before that. So mankind's been doing it for thousands of years. There must be something good about it and something wrong about not doing it.
Yeah, I mean, people have just outsourced their thinking. They have apps now where it tells you when you're thirsty and should drink water. It's like, oh, I just can't. My natural sense of thirst is not good enough. I better rely on an app to tell me when to take a sip of water. It's just absolutely ridiculous. But anyways, so
over meddling.
Yeah. So
over medicalize the simplest things in life, haven't we?
Yeah, the simplest things. Yeah, something that is just a basic human instinct, right? But yeah, so no. Today's guest has been Tony Edwards, author of 2 books about alcohol. One is the good news about booze, and then the second, which is the newest one, the very good news about wine. So, Tony, just let people know where they can find your books in the U.S., the UK. I imagine Amazon might be the easiest, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. And then, secondly, just leave us with a final thought related to this podcast.
Amazon is where to get the books, because they're printed by Amazon. I couldn't find a publisher to publish my books. They all said this is too pro-alcohol. So it's very interesting how publishers are still within that prohibitionist mindset. And I did try very hard to get a proper publisher. And so Amazon now prints it on demand. Every time you press the button on Amazon, it will print a copy for you, your personal copy. And that's a very clever system they've got. So find it on Amazon. And all I would just say to your listeners is thank you for listening and your very good health. Cheers.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.